fantastic quote. And my punchline, which was that demographers never expect infinite growth, right? And I would say, leaving Malthus aside, that it's really important that we give some consideration to the fact that in every developed country, for example, we have areas of decline. And in many developed countries, we have overall decline, so at a macro level. And so what I'll spend the next few minutes talking about is the example of the United States, which continues to experience fairly strong population growth, yet experiences population decline in particular areas. And I'd like to make 2 points, because I come at this from both a geographer and a demographer standpoint, that first of all, I think it's not so much whether or not we talk about growth versus decline at the urban level, but what the sources of the change are, because demographic change comes about in many different ways. And second, the context in which this demographic change is taking place, I think, is also very important. So knowing what is happening in the areas surrounding a particular city, I think, is key to making good policy. So the United States, between about 2000 and 2010, experienced 10% growth. So our population is still increasing in a rather healthy fashion compared to other developed countries. But what I wanted to show you with this map was that it's possible to have 10% population growth and yet experience decline on a fairly vast geographical level. So anything you see blue on this map are areas, counties we call them, that experience decline in the last 10 years, compared to red, which are the areas where we experienced increase. So this is what population increase can look like. It's actually decline for a big part of the country. And if we look at population change by different types of places, we see that actually, like many other places in the world, our growth is happening in cities. It's happening in metropolitan areas. So if the US as a whole grew, this is 2000 to 2009 for these data, grew by about 9%, metropolitan areas grew by over 10%. And as we look at sort of smaller areas, so micropolitan areas, which are smaller cities and their surrounding areas, and non-metro, so rural areas, we see that the growth patterns change a great deal, and that actually most of our population is living in metropolitan areas, most of our growth is happening in metropolitan areas, and yet, even in metropolitan areas, we have more than 15% of areas that are experiencing decline. So even in the areas where we experience growth, growth is not uniform. There are patches of decline. For many of you, this is perhaps nothing new, but cities, rural areas, they all have to grow or decline through some combination of either natural increase, so births, deaths, domestic migration, so people moving around inside of a country, or people coming from outside of a country. There is no other way to achieve growth or decline. And so for change to happen, it has to come through one of these avenues. And the point that I would like to leave you with, even if you end convinced that growth is still the way to think about change in the next 50 years in urban areas, that where the change is coming from for particular places, I think really matters, right? So whether you get increase because you have more births than deaths, right, for a particular city, is different potentially from whether all of your growth comes from international migration. From a policy standpoint, it's very important because it tells you where you need to direct your finances, where you need to spend your money. But I think it also affects the kinds of places that we're looking at. So in the US, and I think that we're unusual for many developed countries, a lot of our growth still comes from natural increase. We have many more births than deaths. But if you look at metropolitan areas, a lot of this is natural increase and net immigration. So it's people coming from outside the country, or people being born, that actually a lot of the change, a lot of the growth is not coming from immigration, from internal migration rather. And if we look at these areas here, the rural areas, we see that they actually have net domestic outmigration from these areas. So people are leaving them. We see the shrinkage. We see it on the map that I showed you. But also not so much of a gain from natural increase. These aren't cities. So today we don't talk about them very much. But I think that going forward, policy has to be thinking about what happens when these areas get left behind to the advantage of the other areas, right? Especially eventually when we talk about stable or declining fertility rates, all of your growth, your population growth, it has to come from people leaving somewhere else, whether they leave another country or they leave another part of your territory, they're still leaving some other place, so someone is likely suffering. And with these maps, I just wanted to point out that the geography actually matters as well. Whether we look at migration or natural increase, decrease, or whether places, as I say, fire on all three cylinders, whether places grow both from natural increase and domestic migration and from immigration, has a geographical component. So particular parts of our country are more affected by one component over another. I'm much more interested in the scenario of decline, but I think that this holds for population increase, but also decrease. And this was a little bit of a surprise to me in looking at the nature of population change at all geographic levels in the U.S., that natural increase is almost always positive for our metropolitan areas. So it's very rare to see a metropolitan area, a city that's declining in population because of natural decrease. So even in cities where population is shrinking, the shrinkage is not coming from deaths exceeding births, it's coming from out-migration. But the highest growth rates, the places that grow the fastest in the US, are the ones that manage to combine all three components of change, right? And I think that if we turn our attention to decline, it's important to think about the ways in which natural decrease and out-migration can work together to create a sort of a perfect storm that makes a place have very hard time turning itself around. So if the demographic context matters, I think the geographical context matters as well. So what's going on around a place in terms of growth or decline has huge impacts for both sets of places. And I think we can, maybe I differentiate across three different potential scenarios where you could be a city in decline or a city growing, but everyone around you is experiencing something different. Your relationship with your neighboring areas, and this could be a neighborhood within a city, but it could also be the hinterland around an urban area. Your relationship is different than if everyone is suffering, if everyone is in decline, but you're surrounded by a broader area of growth. This is what happens in the US right now, that you have concentrations of decline in an overall environment of growth. So the conversations are very different. When you talk to somebody from some other part of the country, their mentality is still 10% population increase, and it makes it difficult to find the common ground. Or you could be like some European countries where it's not just you who's in decline, it's everyone who's in decline, and so everyone has to work together to figure out the best future. I'm moving very quickly. And this is just to show you quickly how geographically clustered increase and decrease are for metropolitan areas. Those are the darker colors. So this dark green, this is our decline. But see, these areas here, I would argue, are different from perhaps areas down here, where what we have is actually decline in an urban area surrounded by decline in all of the rural areas as well. These are regions that they're in decline at multiple levels, compared to areas here where you have decline, but it's surrounded by growth, right? And I would argue that suggests different policies going forward. I'm finishing. In the US, one thing that's important is that we have cities that grow for particular reasons. So we have many cities that are, for example, retirement destinations. These do not rely on births at all. They rely purely on people coming in from the outside. And so for us, should there be a change, should we get a surprise or what I call a turnaround, those cities have a hard time figuring out how to change what they do because everything is based on attracting people from the outside. Or in some larger cities in the US where for a long time we've lost our educated, we've lost our creative class, they've out-migrated when they start a family, and then all of a sudden they decide to stay. Well, what do you do with them, right? Because the services don't exist, the infrastructure doesn't exist. It's a surprise for the policymakers. And then everything I've said very quickly, one thing I have not touched on is the fact that we could swap people. We could have zero net migration, lots of in-migration, lots of out-migration in a city, with no net change, and yet have completely changed the characteristics of the population. So I haven't mentioned at all the potential for compositional change here. And that I see, having looked at a range of areas in the United States, that international migration, as much as it can be seen as problematic, can actually also be seen as a bellwether for the future. Where international migrants do not want to go are the places I think are most at risk. Because international migrants incur lots of costs to travel larger distances. The places they want to go are often the more dynamic places. So where you see places in the US that international migrants don't particularly want to be, those are the places that we might want to focus on. And I would like to make a brief argument for the fact that if one were to plan correctly, that looking ahead, shrinkage or decline needn't be unhealthy, it needn't be bad. It's simply a question of planning for the future and looking ahead. And for reasons of data and time, I've focused on fairly large pieces of geography, but the same argument could be made for neighborhoods within a city. That it's important to look forward and think, what will we do when the dynamics change, and instead of growing, a population is stable or shrinking? How can we plan for that in the future? And that's it.